what I've learned through that process is take on the mindset is before you give up on yourself and before you say, I can't do this, take it one day at a time.
Hey everyone, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of the Brand Power Analysis. Today I have on Danielle, a very special guest. We were kind of chatting before our call a little bit here in our podcast. And so I'm just going to let Danielle give herself a little bit of time to talk about herself, what she's doing, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Well, thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited for our conversation. I started my career in corporate America. I was in corporate America for 20 years and led a team for a Fortune 500 company before leaving the corporate world through the pandemic and then starting a business on speaking and business on consulting. And now I really focus in on helping people develop the grit, resilience, and courage to thrive through change.
I love that. Grit. It's like I mentioned earlier, it's a huge component with our business and within our business. So why don't you tell me a little bit about what grit means to you and how you're kind of pushing that forward within what you're doing?
Yeah. So grit to me is aligning your purpose with your passion and matching that with determination and action. And then in addition to that, it is being resilient and being resilient towards your long-term goals. So if you have a defining purpose and you're clear on what your purpose is, that is going to be the fuel for your passion and what you do. And there's going to be setbacks and there's going to be obstacles that face your way, but it's the resilience to keep going and refusing to give up that is going to get you from step A to step B. But it's also going to be matched with with action, because without action, then we're just hoping and not actually implementing a plan in place.
Yeah. I think a huge thing about grit is the whole concept of the purpose aligning with your goals. And so can you tell me a little bit about how you yourself kind of align grit with how you are following your purpose?
Yeah. So we all have that kind of defining moment in our life where a series of either a pivotal event or a series of events take place that shifts our path. And 2020, like many of us, was that year for me. And it wasn't just one event, it was a series of events. And it was the beginning of the year. My husband had served a year deployment in Iraq. So he had just come back from Iraq. And a lot of people ask me, I don't know how you did, how did you lead a team with traveling and had my twins at the time were 2 years old? I don't know how you did that. And I said, you know what? That was a challenging year, but honestly, the transition back home is harder. I believe the transition back home is harder. He spent a year in a war zone as a Black Hawk pilot, and he comes back, and his kids at the time were just learning to walk, and they're learning how to use a spoon. And all of a sudden he comes back to the twos and they're throwing temper tantrums, and he's going, wait a minute, what is this? So it started the year with the transition with him coming home. Then shortly after, I lost my mom to suicide in a very tragic event and losing my mom. And then just a week after that, the pandemic hit, world shut down. And then shortly after that, I decided to leave a very toxic work environment that I had been in. I had worked for a company for 7 years, and towards the tail end, it had been a toxic work environment. So it was a series of events that really had me take a step back and reflect and look at, what do I want my life to look like? What do I want my future to be? And more importantly, when I do pass on, what do I want my legacy to be? And by asking that question, I was able to define and reflect into, what do I want my purpose to be? And that shifted my life. It shifted from me making the decision to say, I'm going to leave corporate. I have a greater purpose of wanting to help people beyond just my immediate team, but on a global perspective. And that's what started the journey of starting the business and being a keynote speaker. And then it transitioned into writing a book and starting a podcast and being in alignment with my purpose, my values and beliefs. That's what helped me develop the grit to achieve my goals.
That's wonderful. Why don't you tell me a little bit? I know we talked about your podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my podcast is The Grit Factor, and it's in alignment with my book that's going to be coming out at the end of 2023. So The Grit Factor, my book, is break through the 7 roadblocks standing between you and achieving your goals. And it's about how to thrive in all areas of your life, personally, professionally. And it's going to be in alignment with the podcast, The Grit Factor, because that's going to be sharing stories of people who have overcome adversity, who have overcome obstacles, and they share their intimate stories on how they developed grit and how they've been able to overcome these obstacles and achieve personal and professional success.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. So it's kind of a motivational podcast mixed with tips and tricks around the grit factor that can help people get past certain hurdles more effectively.
Yes. So definitely a lot of motivation, but more importantly, matched motivation with how can I apply the lessons learned through other people's lives into my own life. So if there is a particular athlete that's going to be on the podcast and they're talking about maybe some challenges that they've overcome throughout their career, what were the lessons learned and how can that translate into other people's lives?
Yeah, and that's great because athletes themselves have this ability to build certain leadership skills, but then they usually tend to lack some other skills that business owners learn throughout the process of having a business before athletes do.
Yes.
One thing that you really brought up there was your seven tips, and I kind of want to get into mindset a little bit. But before we do, I mean, I guess it kind of relates. I want to talk a little bit about burnout because I think that mindset and burnout are very intertwined with each other, and so I'd love to hear your take on steps that possibly people could take, and maybe even some signs that they need to start taking steps towards relieving that burnout.
Yeah. So I learned the tools, strategies, tips on how to overcome burnout the year that my husband was deployed. So when he told me I'm going to deploy, my immediate reaction was, I'm going to have to quit my job. There's no way that I could be doing overnight travels every single week and also being the primary caretaker of my twin boys at the time. And these two, let me tell you, these two are like squirrels that have 3 shots of espresso. They have a lot of energy. They are thrill seekers. They follow the bloodline of my husband as a Black Hawk pilot. So it's a lot to manage. And what I've learned through that process is take on the mindset is before you give up on yourself and before you say, I can't do this, take it one day at a time and know that there's going to be days that are going to be harder than others. And you can take it one day at a time. And from there, you can decide, yes, this is something that I can continue to do, or no, this isn't. I was very in tuned and in alignment with understanding that part of the mindset is taking care of the emotional, mental, physical well-being. Some of the signs that you're burnt out is irritability, anger. Like, are you one to quickly fuel the fire when somebody cuts you off on the road? And, you fill the car with anger. Another sign of emotional burnout is disengagement, lack of focus, lack of clarity. There's so many different signs of emotional burnout, but there's ways that you can take steps to prevent it. First and foremost, nutrition, and your body is is your body is basically the foundation of how we function. So nutrition is extremely important when it comes to taking care of our body. Water. Our brain is made up of 70% water. Our body needs to have water. So I typically will drink about half my body weight in ounces. I can tell when I don't have enough hydration in my body because I will get migraines. Even today, I felt like the incoming of a migraine. I was like, "Ooh, I haven't had my water intake." Physical activity. Now, I had bought a Peloton. I had the intentions of, if I can't go to a gym, I'm going to buy this Peloton and I'm going to work out. And I think I had 25 rides in 1 year. It was
Yeah.
not a lot. Yeah. Because I realized at that time I needed sleep. That was the most important. That's what my body needed. So being in tune with your body and what your body needs and what it's craving, at that time I needed sleep. But I still got my physical activity by, you think about the times that we're working throughout the entire day. And by the time we wrap up our day, we're exhausted and we're just kind of mentally drained. Well, how do you transition from, let's say you look at an Excel spreadsheet all day, or you're putting out fires. How do you transition from that mental capacity to life at home? And so every day I would walk in the door and the first thing I would do is grab my kids and let's go for a walk. Let's have the fresh air, the vitamin D from the sun, the experiencing, hearing birds and nature. It sounds so, these are not revolutionary, but sometimes we forget how important just those little steps that we can take to prevent the burnout. I would say also the last thing, or not the last thing, but I would say another aspect that's really important is protecting our mental state of mind. And what I mean by that is, what information are we taking in that is either adding to our mental well-being or taking away from it? So and I talk about, in my book, I talk about social media, for example. The statistics show that we touch our phones about 200 times per day, which seems crazy. But if you look at your social media, is it filled with, for an entrepreneur, for example, is it filled with other entrepreneurs where you're comparing yourself, or is your feed filled with people that are giving you that motivational prep to say you can do it and believe in yourself? And are you listening to podcasts like yours that are talking, that are putting you in, like, they're feeding your soul and motivating you? Or are you spending your days, and I want to say be informed about what's going on, but are you spending your days consumed with the news and politics that just aggravate us, and these they're called clickbait news articles that will different titles, which will either infuse, or I would say exacerbate, negative or positive emotions?